Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into one of the most dramatic geopolitical shocks to hit Europe in recent years, the sudden collapse of Russia's Baltic rail link and the explosive miscalculation by Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko that has triggered a full-scale rail shutdown across the European Union. What started as a quiet diplomatic standoff has now spiraled into a crisis, affecting trade, security, and the delicate balance of power from the Baltic Sea to Moscow. In this video, we're going to unpack exactly what happened, why it happened, and what this means for Russia, Belarus, the EU, and the wider world. The situation began with a small but symbolic policy shift in Minsk. Lukashenko, pressured by internal economic troubles and seeking to prove loyalty to Moscow, made a move that he believed would strengthen his political grip. He restricted the limited remaining transit privileges that EU goods enjoyed while crossing Belarusian territory. This gesture was meant to signal defiance toward Brussels and solidarity with the Kremlin. What he didn't expect was how quickly the European Union would respond and how devastating the consequences would be. The EU had been monitoring the growing alignment between Minsk and Moscow. Over the last few years, Belarus had become increasingly dependent on Russia economically, militarily, and politically. As sanctions tightened and opposition movements grew stronger, Lukashenko leaned more heavily on Putin for protection. But this latest transit restriction crossed a line. The EU saw it as an intentional disruption to critical supply routes. And in a move that stunned analysts, the European Commission approved a full suspension of all EU-bound rail activity through Belarus, rerouting key cargo flows and isolating both Minsk and Moscow from some of their most strategically important trade corridors. The shutdown didn't just affect European shipments. It also severed Russia's Baltic rail link, a vital connection Moscow used to reach ports that shipped out millions of tons of fuel, coal, chemicals, metals, and manufactured goods. That link had already been weakened by sanctions, but it still served as a pressure valve, allowing Russia to maintain some degree of commercial access to global markets. When the EU cut the cord, it left Moscow scrambling for alternatives that simply don't exist at the same scale or efficiency. Lukashenko's decision, which he thought would be a simple political message, suddenly transformed into a catastrophic blunder. Economists are now calling it one of the most self-destructive moves in recent Belarusian history. Instead of tightening Belarus' alliance with Russia, the move triggered an EU response that has undermined both economies simultaneously. And to make matters worse, the Kremlin was caught completely off guard. Russia had not expected the EU to shut down its Baltic corridor entirely, at least not this fast or this decisively. As the news spread, rail operators across Europe and Eurasia immediately began rerouting shipments. Cargo that once flowed through Belarus is now being redirected through the Balkans, Turkey, Scandinavia, and even as far as Central Asia. The sudden chaos has caused major delays, rising shipment costs, and concerns about a long-term structural shift in European rail infrastructure. Analysts believe that once alternative pipelines and corridors are strengthened, these new routes may permanently replace the old Belarus-Russia corridor, further isolating both regimes. For Belarus, the economic consequences could be devastating. The country relies heavily on transit revenue. Every container, every tanker, every freight car passing through Belarus brings in millions annually. With the shutdown, those earnings have evaporated almost instantly. And with EU relations already frozen and sanctions tightening, Belarus has few options left. The government is now facing pressure from business elites and industrial sectors who fear collapse if new trade solutions aren't found. For Russia, the impact is even more strategic. Moscow had used the Baltic rail link not just for trade, but as a political tool. It served as a reminder of Russia's reach and its ability to maintain influence beyond its borders. Losing this corridor undermines Moscow's leverage and complicates its efforts to sustain wartime logistics, energy exports, and foreign market access. Despite public statements downplaying the shutdown, internal reports indicate that Russia's transport ministry was blindsided. This crisis also marks a turning point in EU strategic posture. For decades, Brussels favored cautious diplomacy with both Moscow and Minsk, preferring slow, incremental pressure rather than abrupt actions. But the Baltic rail shutdown shows a very different approach, one that is more assertive, coordinated, and willing to inflict real economic costs. European leaders appear prepared for a long-term decoupling from Russian and Belarusian infrastructure. And now that the shutdown has begun, reversing it may prove extremely difficult. Meanwhile, Lukashenko's reputation inside Belarus has taken yet another hit. His supporters expected stability. His critics expected confrontation. But no one expected a move that would shut down the country's most profitable transit system. Russian officials, though outwardly supportive, are reported to be privately furious. Moscow now has to allocate resources to compensate for the lost route, potentially funneling more financial aid into Minsk just to keep its economy afloat. That puts Lukashenko in a weaker bargaining position than ever before. International observers see the crisis as a sign of shifting geopolitical tectonics. The EU is becoming more self-reliant. Russia and Belarus are becoming more isolated. Alternative transit corridors are emerging across Turkey, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. And the old Soviet-era logistical networks that once tied Europe and Eurasia together are slowly being dismantled. This isn't just a railway issue, it's a restructuring of entire regional systems. The shutdown also raises concerns about escalation. Belarus has already hinted at reciprocal actions, while Russia has accused the EU of economic aggression, but in reality, both Moscow and Minsk have limited options. Retaliation could trigger even more severe sanctions. Attempts to pressure neighboring countries could backfire, and any military posturing would risk drawing NATO attention. The EU move has boxed them into a corner diplomatically, strategically, and economically. One of the most immediate consequences is the impact on energy markets. The Baltic rail link was a major artery for Russia's refined petroleum products. With that route cut off, shipments must rely more heavily on pipelines, which are already at maximum capacity, or on alternative rail lines that are slower and more expensive. Fuel exporters are warning of looming bottlenecks, and some markets could experience price fluctuations as supply chains adjust. Agricultural exports are also taking a hit. Russia and Belarus both relied on Baltic, adjacent routes to ship grain, fertilizers, and raw materials. The longer these products sit in storage or move through inefficient routes, the more the global market feels the pressure. While the immediate effects are manageable, economists warn that prolonged disruption could trigger spikes in food prices in parts of the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. Inside the EU, however, the mood is surprisingly unified. Member states that once disagreed on Russia's strategy are now aligned in supporting the shutdown. The chaos caused by Lukashenko's actions provided a rare moment of consensus, and with the war in Ukraine still ongoing, EU governments want to demonstrate strength and coordination. Cutting the rail link was not only a strategic move, but also a symbolic one, signaling that Europe is no longer willing to tolerate intimidation tactics from Minsk or Moscow. As the situation evolves, One of the biggest questions is whether Belarus will try to reverse course. Lukashenko is known for abrupt policy changes and unpredictable behavior. In the past, he has attempted to repair relations with the EU when under pressure, only to swing back toward Moscow later. But this time, the damage may be too deep. The shutdown has already set new logistical systems in motion. Even if Belarus begged the EU to restore transit rights, it's unlikely that Europe would accept without major political concessions. Russia is facing the same dilemma. The Kremlin is used to weathering economic storms, but this crisis hits a strategic nerve. Moscow's influence over the Baltic region relied heavily on these supply lines. Losing them weakens Russia's long-term leverage. It also exposes deeper vulnerabilities in Russia's infrastructure network, especially its dependence on Soviet-era routes that no longer fit modern geopolitical realities. The crisis has also sparked debate within Europe about strengthening internal rail networks. Some countries are pushing for massive infrastructure projects to reduce reliance on routes passing near Russia or Belarus. If approved, these projects could permanently deepen the divide between Europe and the Russian sphere, cementing new transport corridors that reflect the emerging geopolitical landscape. There is also the human element. Thousands of workers across Belarus and Russia rely on the rail industry for employment. With the shutdown, many face uncertainty. Factories that depended on EU imports or exports are cutting shifts. Union leaders are warning of possible unrest. And businesses that once relied on easy access to European markets are now scrambling to stay afloat. Meanwhile, European businesses are adjusting more smoothly. While some industries are reporting delays and rising costs, the EU diversified economy allows it to adapt faster. Companies quickly shift to alternative logistics hubs, ports, and rail lines. Governments are providing financial assistance to offset disruptions. Unlike Belarus and Russia, the EU has the resources and flexibility to absorb the shock. But the biggest question remains: what comes next? Will this crisis escalate into a larger confrontation, or will it fade into a prolonged standoff with no clear resolution? Analysts are divided. Some believe Russia might try to reassert control by pressuring neighboring states or launching economic countermeasures. Others think the Kremlin will focus on internal adaptation, quietly absorbing the loss as it continues long-term shifts toward Asia. Belarus, meanwhile, may struggle simply to stay afloat. For now, what's clear is that Lukashenko's move has fundamentally altered the regional dynamic. His attempt to show strength ended up exposing weakness. His effort to support Moscow backfired by harming Russian strategic interests. And his decision to restrict EU transit sparked the very response he hoped to avoid, a decisive European counter-strike that cut off his own country's lifeline. The Baltic rail shutdown is more than a policy change. It's a warning signal about the fragility of old geopolitical systems. It shows how quickly a single miscalculation can ripple across borders, markets, and political structures. And it underscores how Europe, once cautious and hesitant, is now increasingly assertive in defending its interests. As Russia and Belarus struggle to adapt, the EU is already moving forward, building new pathways and reinforcing its internal unity. And as these shifts continue, the region may be entering a new era, one marked by more fragmentation, more competition, and more unpredictable moves from leaders desperate to maintain control. This crisis is still unfolding, and we will continue to monitor developments as they happen. The collapse of Russia's Baltic link is not just a regional issue. It's part of a much larger story about power, influence, and the future of Eurasia. How the next weeks and months play out will shape the geopolitical landscape for years to come. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for more updates as this situation develops.